A woman kneels in an empty cathedral, hands clasped, whispering the same prayer she's whispered for 3 years. The candles have burned down to nothing. You know this scene. Maybe it was you on your bedroom floor at 3 a.m., crafting the perfect text to send to someone who stopped reading your messages months ago. Maybe it was the promotion you begged for, the friend whose forgiveness you chased like a dog with a bone, the parent whose approval became your religion. We've all knelt in that cathedral of want, believing that if we just pray harder, surrender more completely, offer our dignity on a silver platter, somehow the universe will finally say yes. But in this cathedral, something shifts. The woman's whispered pleas begin to echo differently off the stone walls, growing distorted, multiplying into a chorus of desperate voices. As she looks up, she realizes she is not alone. Hundreds of shadowy figures fill the pews behind her, all kneeling, all whispering the same desperate prayers to different gods: love, success, recognition, forgiveness. The air grows thick with the weight of their collective begging, and she notices something horrifying: chains around their wrists, so fine they're nearly invisible, stretching from each person to empty pedestals at the front of the cathedral where their objects of desire should stand, but don't. The woman reaches toward her chain, and as her fingers touch the ethereal metal, she sees the truth written in the cathedral's stained glass windows. Scenes of merchants trading away their souls for fool's gold, of kings prostrating themselves before empty thrones, of lovers dissolving into shadows while chasing phantoms. Schopenhauer whispered it centuries ago. Our will to live is nothing but an endless cycle of wanting, getting, and wanting again. But when we beg, we invert the natural order and make ourselves slaves to the very things that were meant to serve our flourishing. The woman's prayer changes. Instead of "please give me," she whispers, "I release you." And as the words leave her lips, her chain shatters like glass. The shadow figures behind her wail as she stands. But she walks toward the cathedral doors, each step lighter than the last. At the threshold, she turns back once and sees that her emptied pedestal now holds a single object: a mirror reflecting nothing but light. This is what psychologists call learned helplessness, first identified by Martin Seligman through experiments with dogs who eventually stopped trying to escape electric shocks, even when escape became possible. In modern life, it manifests when we repeatedly seek validation from emotionally unavailable partners, when we over-explain ourselves to people who've already made up their minds, when we chase opportunities that consistently reject us instead of creating new paths. Schopenhauer would call this a particularly cruel trick of the will, that blind force that drives all existence, convincing us that our suffering has meaning when it's actually just the ego's desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of control through submission. The ancients called it a curse. Today, psychology names it learned helplessness. What altar are you still kneeling before? What chain have you wrapped so tightly around your wrist that you've forgotten it was ever a choice? The cathedral door stands open, but only you can decide if your prayer will be a plea or a declaration of independence. Some chains shatter only when we stop pulling against them and start walking away. A man tends a garden where every rose grows with its roots in the sky and its blooms buried in the earth. He waters the soil religiously, wondering why nothing beautiful ever surfaces. We've all planted these backwards roses, the relationship where you give everything and somehow become smaller, the job where your harder work earns you less respect, the friendship where your loyalty is rewarded with betrayal. You keep watering the ground, convinced that if you just give more, sacrifice deeper, humble yourself further, something beautiful must eventually break through the surface. In this impossible garden, the man discovers others, women and men alike, all tending their own patches of inverted flora. They move like sleepwalkers through rows of buried beauty, carrying watering cans filled with their own tears, their own blood, their own dreams ground to pulp. The gardener notices that some have been here so long their skin has taken on the color of soil. Their movements have synchronized with the seasons of futility. Their buried roses have grown massive root systems in the sky, creating a canopy of what could have been, while the earth beneath their feet remains barren. One day, a child wanders into the garden, looks around, and asks the question that shatters everything. Why don't you just turn the roses right side up? The gardeners pause, watering cans dripping. They look at each other with the slow horror of awakening from a dream. In that moment, they remember that they planted these roses upside down themselves, not because someone forced them to, but because somewhere along the way, they believed that suffering was the only currency that could purchase love. The man kneels and begins to dig up his first rose. As he lifts it from the earth and plants it properly, the bloom explodes into color, so vivid it hurts to look at directly. But here's the paradox Schopenhauer understood so deeply. The moment the rose blooms correctly, he realizes he no longer needs it to prove anything. The beauty was never meant to be earned through martyrdom. It was meant to be witnessed, appreciated, then released to bloom for its own sake. The other gardeners watch in silence as he tends his right-side roses with casual grace, no longer desperate for each bloom to validate his worth. Some begin to turn their own gardens right side up. Others clutch their watering cans tighter and sink deeper into the soil, unable to imagine a world where beauty doesn't require burial. This is what Carl Jung termed the shadow of the persona, the parts of ourselves we've buried so deep in our attempt to be acceptable that we forget they were ever meant to see sunlight. It manifests when we consistently choose partners who can't see our value, when we downplay our achievements to avoid threatening others, when we apologize for taking up space that was always ours to occupy. Schopenhauer recognized this as the will to live turning against itself, mistaking self-negation for virtue and suffering for wisdom. In myth, it was a ghost. In you, it's the habit you can't see, the inverted persona. Which of your roses are still planted upside down? What beauty have you buried so deep you've forgotten it was ever meant to bloom in the light? The child's question echoes. Why don't you just turn them right side up? Sometimes revolution is as simple as refusing to plant your flowers in the grave. A clockmaker spends her life crafting timepieces that run backwards, believing she can undo the moment she first said, "I'm sorry," when she meant to say, "No." You know this workshop. Maybe it's the mental replay of that conversation where you crumpled instead of standing firm. Maybe it's the relationship you keep trying to resurrect by becoming smaller, quieter, more convenient. Maybe it's the apology you're still crafting for existing too loudly in a world that prefers you diminished. We've all become clockmakers of regret, believing we can engineer our way back to the moment before we chose submission over sovereignty. The workshop exists in a space between seconds where time moves like honey, and every surface reflects not images, but moments, thousands of crystalline spheres showing different versions of the same scene. In one sphere, she says no and walks away with dignity intact. In another, she stands her ground, and the other person respects her more for it. In yet another, she chooses solitude over compromise and discovers it tastes like freedom rather than loneliness. The clockmaker moves between these alternate realities, her fingers stained with the oil of temporal mechanisms, trying to build a machine that will allow her to step into one of these other spheres. But as she works, she begins to notice something unsettling. Each backward-running clock in her workshop is powered by a piece of her present self, a slice of her confidence here, a fragment of her joy there, a segment of her future, possibilities melted down and repurposed as fuel for impossibility. The more clocks she builds, the more translucent she becomes, until she realizes with dawning horror that she's been trading her present reality for the ghost of alternative histories. On the workbench, a half-finished clock catches her attention. This one runs forward, its gears gleaming with unused potential. As she picks it up, she sees her reflection in its face. Not the diminished version she's become, but the woman she could still choose to be. Schopenhauer knew this trap well. The will creates suffering, not just through wanting what we don't have, but through wanting what we can never have. The past reshaped, the self unbroken, the word unspoken. The clockmaker raises her hammer. The choice crystallizes. Destroy the backward clocks and forge ahead, or continue crafting elaborate machines for traveling to a destination that exists only in regret. She looks once more at the spheres showing her alternative histories, then smashes the first backward clock. As its gears scatter, she feels a piece of her present self return, not unchanged, but strengthened by the integration of what was learned. One by one, she destroys the machines of temporal escape. With each shattered clock, the workshop grows brighter. The spheres of alternative histories fade, and the forward-running timepiece in her hands begins to tick with the rhythm of possibility rather than regret. This is what psychologists call rumination, the compulsive mental rehearsal of past events, typically negative ones, identified by Susan Nolan Hoeksema as a major factor in depression and anxiety. It shows up when we endlessly replay social interactions, looking for what we should have said differently, when we research our ex-partner's social media for clues about what went wrong, when we mentally rewrite every moment where we chose peace over confrontation. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will caught in a particularly vicious cycle, using the present moment's energy to futilely attempt to change what has already crystallized into the unchangeable past. The ancients called it a curse. Today, psychology names it rumination. What clocks are you still trying to run backwards? What version of your past self are you mourning instead of honoring by becoming who she was always meant to evolve into? The workshop of regret closes only when you choose to build something new, rather than repair something that was never truly broken, just incomplete, waiting for this moment of recognition to set time moving in its proper direction again. A sculptor works with stone that vanishes the moment she stops carving, forcing her to create faster and faster until her hands bleed and her art becomes invisible. This is the studio of modern desperation. Maybe you recognize the frantic energy, the way you've learned to perform your worth through constant motion, constant giving, constant availability. The job where your value is measured not by what you create, but by how long you work. The relationship where love is doled out in proportion to how much of yourself you sacrifice. The friendship that exists only when you're useful. We've all been sculptors of disappearing stone, believing that if we just work harder, give more, need less, we can carve something permanent from materials designed to dissolve. In this ethereal studio, the air itself seems made of urgency. Other sculptors work beside her, their movements becoming increasingly frantic as their stones fade faster and faster. Some have given up on actual art and simply run their hands over empty air, going through the motions of creation with nothing left to sculpt. Others have learned to work with their eyes closed, pretending not to see their masterpieces dissolving even as they birth them. A few have developed a terrible skill. They can sense the exact moment their stone will vanish and have learned to find strange satisfaction in the anticipation of loss rather than the hope of completion. The sculptor notices something peculiar about her studio. In the corners, where she never looks while working, sit blocks of regular stone, solid, permanent, waiting. But they're covered in dust, ignored, because they don't carry the addictive urgency of the disappearing medium. They don't make her feel important through emergency. They don't validate her identity as someone who can work miracles under impossible conditions. One day, her hands are so torn from carving against time that she cannot continue. In the enforced stillness, she hears something she's never noticed before: silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of space where something genuine could take root. She walks to one of the dusty, permanent blocks and places her bloodied palms against its surface. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't demand immediate action. It simply offers itself as raw potential for something she might actually want to create rather than something she feels compelled to save. As she lifts her first tool to the solid stone, she realizes the difference. She's no longer sculpting to prevent disappearance. She's creating to bring something new into existence. Schopenhauer understood this distinction as the difference between will-driven action, compulsive, fear-based, ultimately suffering-inducing, and genuine, aesthetic contemplation, peaceful, present, intrinsically fulfilling. The other sculptors pause in their frantic work to watch her slow, deliberate movements. Some return to their vanishing stones with renewed desperation, but a few put down their tools and walk toward the permanent blocks they've been ignoring. This is what psychologists call the anxious attachment style, first identified by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth through observations of children's responses to separation from caregivers. In adult relationships, it manifests as an intense fear of abandonment that drives us to overgive, over-explain, and over-accommodate in desperate attempts to maintain connection. In professional settings, it appears as compulsive overwork and the inability to set boundaries. In friendships, it shows up as always being available for others while rarely asking for support ourselves. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will to live tricking us into believing that our value is conditional and must be constantly re-earned through sacrifice. In myth, it was a ghost. In you, it's the habit you can't see, anxious attachment. What are you sculpting from stone that's designed to disappear? What masterpiece are you trying to create from materials that dissolve the moment you stop proving your worth? The permanent blocks have been waiting in the corner all along. They don't need you to save them, just to see them, to choose the patient work of creating something that can actually last, because it doesn't depend on your desperation to exist. A merchant who sells mirrors that show only what people want to see realizes her own reflection has disappeared entirely, and she must choose between her profitable illusions and the terrifying possibility of seeing herself clearly. This is the shop at the end of every journey into self-deception. Maybe you've wandered here after years of curating a life that looks perfect from the outside while feeling hollow within. Maybe you've arrived after a relationship built on who you pretended to be rather than who you actually are. Maybe you've spent so long showing others what they wanted to see that you've forgotten what you actually look like when no one is performing for anyone. The shop exists in a space between what is and what we wish were true. Its walls lined with mirrors of every size and shape. Each mirror has a small placard describing its particular deception, shows you as the victim in every story, reflects only your potential, never your present, displays everyone else's flaws magnified, yours minimized, reveals only what others want you to be. The mirrors shimmer with otherworldly beauty, each one crafted to make its viewer feel special, misunderstood, or righteously wronged. Customers flow through the shop in steady streams, drawn by the promise of seeing themselves in ways that validate their existing beliefs about reality. They pay not with money, but with small pieces of authentic self-awareness, dropping fragments of genuine insight into a collection box by the door. The merchant has grown wealthy from this trade, her shop expanding into a vast hall of beautiful deceptions. But today, as she attempts her morning ritual of checking her appearance in the shop's mirrors, she sees nothing, not even an outline, not even a shadow. She moves from mirror to mirror, increasingly frantic, but each reflection shows only the empty space where she should be. The realization strikes like some cold water. She has sold so many false reflections that she no longer exists in any true sense. She has become a ghost of transactions, a curator of others' self-deceptions, who has lost the capacity to see herself at all. In the center of the shop stands a single mirror she's never noticed before, or rather has actively avoided noticing. It's plain, unadorned, and notably dusty from neglect. The placard reads simply, "Shows what is." Her hands tremble as she approaches it, knowing this is the choice Schopenhauer wrote about, the moment when the will to live, having exhausted all its elaborate strategies of self-deception, faces the possibility of genuine self-knowledge, terrifying, liberating, and utterly without guarantees. She looks into the plain mirror. Her reflection appears slowly, like a photograph developing, not the version of herself she's cultivated for others, not the narrative she's constructed about who she is or should be, but something rawer, more complex, shot through with both shadows and unexpected light. She sees the parts of herself she's been hiding, the needs she's been denying, the dreams she's been trading away for the comfort of others' approval. But she also sees something else: aliveness, authenticity, the irreplaceable specificity of being exactly who she is, rather than a carefully edited version designed for mass consumption. Behind her, she hears the sound of other mirrors beginning to crack. Her customers look around in confusion as their comfortable illusions start to fissure, revealing glimpses of reality they're not sure they want to see. Some flee immediately. Others approach the plain mirror with curiosity rather than terror, ready to meet themselves without the buffer of beautiful lies. This is what Carl Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche to become a whole, authentic individual rather than a collection of personas designed to please others. It manifests in modern life when we stop curating our social media to project an image and start sharing our actual experiences, when we choose relationships that see and accept our complexity rather than just our highlights, when we pursue work that aligns with our actual values rather than what we think will impress others. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the rare moment when the will stops driving us toward external validation and allows us to rest in the radical acceptance of what we actually are rather than what we think we should be. The ancients called it a curse. Today, psychology names it individuation. What mirror have you been avoiding? What reflection have you been too afraid to see clearly without the comfortable distortion of self-serving narratives or others' expectations? The plain mirror waits, offering not the comfort of beautiful lies, but the strange relief of finally being seen by yourself exactly as you are, in all your irreplaceable, unrepeatable humanity. Sometimes the most radical act is not changing who you are, but finally admitting who you've always been.